I was 27 in the summer of 2019 when I decided to camp alone on an old rented farm property in southern Idaho. The owner was a quiet older man who lived 2 miles down the dirt road, and he told me the land wasn't used anymore except for hay cutting once every couple of years. I wanted a quiet place where I could be alone for a few days. No loud campsites, no neighbors, no traffic, just open fields, rough fences, slow wind, and the long empty sky. I brought a small tent, a basic cooler, a folding chair, and a little portable stove. I planned on staying 3 nights. The first afternoon felt peaceful. The land was almost too quiet. The fields were dry and yellow, stretching far until they touched a distant tree line to the east. There was an old barn about 100 yards from where I set up my tent. It leaned slightly to one side, with missing boards and a rusted metal roof. A long wooden fence ran past it, but half of the posts were rotting and crooked. I could smell old dirt and dry grass in the hot air. Everything felt empty, like the place had been forgotten for years. When the sun started lowering, the sky turned orange, and the barn cast a long shadow across the field. I felt that natural excitement you get when you know night is coming and you're outdoors alone. It wasn't fear yet, just that alertness that grows the darker it gets. I cooked simple food and watched insects climb up the side of my cooler. The air cooled fast after sunset, and the quiet turned heavier. There were no distant cars, no animals calling, nothing. Just the sound of wind brushing across dry ground. I crawled into my tent around 10, fully expecting an easy night. But I had trouble sleeping. The silence felt strange, almost too perfect, like I was waiting for something to break it. I kept hearing tiny movements in the grass, but I knew it was probably insects or small animals. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. I woke up a couple hours later because the air felt different. Still silent, but heavier, like pressure had dropped. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. My body was tense for no reason I could explain. Then I heard it, slow steps in the grass. Not shuffling like a small animal. Not fast or light like a deer. Heavy, careful steps, spaced apart like someone walking slowly. The sound moved from somewhere near the barn toward my tent, then stopped. I held my breath. The air felt sharp. I didn't want to move the zipper or reach for my light. I just listened. After maybe a minute, the steps started again, but they angled away from me, circling around toward the other side of the tent. Still slow, still heavy, still measured. My throat felt tight. I knew animals didn't move like that, but I kept trying to tell myself it could be something else. A stray cow maybe, or someone from a nearby property checking the land. But nothing felt right about the way it moved or the timing. The steps faded after a while, and eventually I fell asleep again because my body was exhausted. The next morning the air was warm and still. I stepped out of the tent and scanned the area. The grass around my campsite looked slightly pressed down, but the wind could have done that. When I walked toward the barn, I saw something that tightened my stomach. On the dry dirt near one corner of the barn were footprints, adult-sized, bare feet. The edges of them were sharp enough to be recent. They led from the barn toward the field, then curved sharply and disappeared into taller grass. I stood there for a long minute trying to make sense of it. A person with no shoes walking around abandoned farmland in the middle of the night didn't make sense. The owner never mentioned anyone living out here. I didn't want to panic, but I also didn't want to ignore it. During the day, I tried to focus on normal tasks. Cooking, reading, walking the field, but everything felt tense. Every time I looked at the barn, I felt like someone was watching from inside, even though I knew it was empty. At one point, I tried to look through the gaps in the boards. The barn smelled like old straw and rust, and the inside was mostly bare except for a few broken crates and a rusted water trough. Nothing alive, nothing strange. Still, the air inside felt colder than outside, which bothered me more than it should have. I told myself I'd only stay one more night. I didn't want to run back home over something that might be nothing, but I didn't want to push my luck either. When the second night came, I set up my lantern outside and let it run for a bit while I organized things inside my tent. The glow lit the dry grass in a soft yellow circle. The barn sat in darkness beyond the edge of it, its shape barely visible. I kept glancing at it as I moved around. Every time, it felt like the outline of the barn had shifted slightly, like the angle of it changed when I looked away. I knew that was impossible, but my mind kept playing tricks on me. Around 11, the lantern ran out of fuel, and I shut everything down. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind scrape the dry weeds. My chest felt tight with tension. I didn't know if I was imagining the danger or sensing something real, but either way my body believed it. Sometime after midnight, the steps returned. Slow again, careful again. This time they came from behind my tent, so close I could hear the grass flatten under each foot. I froze. My pulse thumped hard in my ears. The air felt thick and warm, but my skin was cold. The steps stopped directly beside the tent. I could hear breathing, very light but steady. Not animal breathing, too slow, too controlled. My arms felt numb. I stayed completely still, afraid even the sound of fabric shifting would give away that I was awake. After what felt like minutes, the steps moved again, heading toward the barn. When they faded, I slowly sat up. I decided that no matter what, I was leaving at sunrise. I barely slept after that. When the first light finally touched the tent, I packed everything fast. But before leaving, I forced myself to check the barn one last time. I felt like I needed to understand what was happening, or at least confirm that no one was hiding in there. The barn door was swollen from age and didn't open easily. I pushed it wide enough to slip inside. Dust floated in the morning light through the broken roof. The place looked the same as before except for one thing. In the dirt near the back wall was a bed-shaped spot of pressed-down hay and a small pile of food wrappers, old granola bars, half-eaten canned food, dried fruit packets. It looked like someone had been sleeping there, someone who brought leftovers from somewhere but didn't want to be found. Beside the pile was a scratched-up metal cup and a thin blanket rolled into a ball. The blanket had dark stains on it, brown and dried. There were also footprints, the same barefoot prints from outside. I felt a strong wave of fear because suddenly everything made sense. Someone had been living out here secretly. Someone who might have mental issues or was hiding from something or just didn't want people around at all. Someone who walked at night, barefoot, quietly, circling my tent. Someone who stood only a few feet away while I slept. I stepped out of the barn and felt the sun warm my face, but my whole body was cold. I packed the last of my gear, loaded it into my car, and drove away without looking back. The dirt road felt longer on the way out than it did coming in. When I reached the main road, I stopped and told the property owner what I found. He looked tired when I explained, not shocked, like he had suspected someone might be using the land but didn't want to think about it. He said he would check it out, maybe call someone to clear the place. I didn't stay to hear what happened after. I just wanted to leave it behind. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night thinking about those slow steps in the grass. Not because I think it was anything supernatural, but because it was real. Someone was out there with me on that farm, moving around in the dark while I tried to sleep. Someone who didn't speak, didn't run, didn't try to scare me. Just watched, just waited. And knowing how close they were, how silent they stood beside my tent, still makes the back of my neck tighten. The ending was simple, but clear. I left as soon as I understood what the danger was. Another human, living hidden, moving barefoot in the dark. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a person, and somehow that made it worse. I was 32 the year I went hunting alone in the northern woods of Alberta, far from the towns and far from anyone who could hear me if something went wrong. I had hunted before, but this time I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that sits so heavy on your ears you can hear your own heartbeat. That was the whole reason I drove 5 hours from Edmonton in my old truck and spent another hour on a narrow dirt road that looked like it hadn't been touched by another vehicle in weeks. It was late October 2018, cold enough that the mornings felt like winter had already arrived. I reached a cutoff near a dry creek bed and stopped. The area was open enough for a tent, but surrounded by dark pines so tight they looked like walls. I set up camp near the tree line, laid out my gear, and checked my rifle 2 or 3 times more than I needed to. I liked routine. Routine kept me calm. The sun was dropping behind the trees by the time everything was ready, and the air kept getting colder, the kind of cold that crawls through your clothes before you even notice. The first night passed quietly. I walked around the nearby ridge early in the morning, hoping to see deer tracks, maybe moose prints if I was lucky. The frost was thick on the grass and made a crunching sound under my boots. The place felt untouched. No old fire rings, no boat marks, no beer cans or trash. It felt like I was the first human there in years. I liked that idea at the time. By noon, nothing had moved. No sound except wind brushing through the pines, and even that disappeared at times. It was strange how silent the place became. The kind of silence where you start to hear things that aren't there. I tried to ignore that feeling and kept walking deeper into the trees, marking my path with orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. Around mid-afternoon, I found something that made me stop. Along the soft mud near a slope, I saw prints, large, deep, too wide to be from a normal boot. They looked almost like boot prints, but the shape was off, like someone walked with a heavy limp or an uneven dragging step. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I crouched down to check them again. They didn't look like animal tracks, not like any tracks I knew. I told myself other hunters sometimes wandered through areas like this, even if it was rare. Still, the shape bothered me. One print was normal looking, the other almost twisted sideways, like the foot had been bent. It gave me a strange feeling I couldn't explain. I walked further and saw more of the same prints, spaced unevenly, as if whoever made them moved slow, stopping a lot. I followed them for a few minutes until they drifted off toward a steep area full of deadfall. I didn't want to climb through that mess, so I turned around and headed back to camp. The sun went down earlier than I expected. The temperature dropped fast, and the cold soaked into everything. I sat outside for a bit, eating from a metal can and listening. The woods felt wrong that night. I couldn't explain why, but something about the stillness bothered me. I tried to sleep early, but the wind picked up and the tent fabric kept shaking. Somewhere after midnight, I woke up to a faint sound, something soft and slow. Not the wind, not an animal moving through brush. This was a steady sound, like someone dragging their boots through leaves. I held my breath and tried to listen. The sound wasn't far. It moved around the edge of my camp, stopped for a moment, then continued again. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, trying to figure out if the noise was a deer, maybe a moose moving carefully. But the steps were too slow, too measured. Animals don't walk like that. They never move with that kind of steady dragging rhythm. The steps circled once, then faded away. I lay awake until dawn, every muscle tense. When light finally came, I stepped outside carefully, checking the ground. The frost made fresh prints stand out clearly. I almost wished I hadn't looked. The same strange tracks from yesterday circled my camp. One normal step, one twisted, dragging step. They came from the trees, looped close to my tent, then went back into the woods behind my camp. I felt a cold pressure in my chest when I saw them. This wasn't an animal, and it wasn't some hunter passing by. Whoever it was had come close on purpose. I packed some gear and walked in the direction the tracks went, keeping my rifle ready. The prints wandered between the trees, sometimes deep, sometimes faint, as if the person kept stopping or shifting weight. After about 100 meters, the tracks suddenly cut sideways, down a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. The path looked used, but only recently. The grass on it was bent and pressed down. I followed it only a short distance before deciding not to go further. Something felt off. The air felt colder on that path, and the trees around it grew too close together. I turned back, trying to stay calm. I told myself it was probably a lost hiker or someone passing through the area. Maybe someone who didn't want to be found. That wasn't comforting, but it was the only explanation I had. The day stayed dead silent. No birds, no crunch of animals breaking branches. The woods felt empty. That bothered me more than the prints. I've hunted long enough to know that when the woods go silent, something is wrong. That night I couldn't relax. I kept checking outside my tent, shining my flashlight at the trees. Each time the beam reached deep between the trunks, the darkness swallowed the light like it had weight. I kept hearing tiny sounds, little snaps, soft rustling, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just my nerves. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the dragging steps again. This time they were closer, slow, heavy. The way the dragging sound scraped across the ground made my stomach twist. I held my rifle and listened, breathing shallow and quiet. The steps stopped right behind my tent. No movement, no breathing, just stillness. Then something brushed the side of the tent, low to the ground, slow and careful. Not an animal, not the wind, something human. I felt a surge of panic rise in my throat. I didn't know whether to stay still or jump outside. I stayed frozen. After a long moment, the dragging steps moved again, heading toward the trees until they faded to nothing. At dawn, I came out and checked the ground again. The prints were there, clearer than before, fresh and sharp. No doubt someone had walked right up against the side of my tent. The twisted footprint dragged deeper, like the person had leaned more on that side. Whoever they were, they had been watching me, studying my camp, maybe waiting for something. I didn't stay another night. I packed fast, barely eating anything. As I loaded my gear, I heard something deep in the woods, a faint crack, like a branch breaking under slow weight. I didn't wait to see what it was. I drove out of the forest faster than I probably should have. Even when the trees cleared and I reached the main dirt road, I kept checking my mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. When I finally reached a gas station an hour later, the noise of cars and people talking felt strange, almost unreal. I stood there for a few minutes just listening to the normal sounds of life, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. I never went back to that area again. I don't know who was out there. I don't know why they watched my camp or why they walked the way they did. Maybe it was someone living out in the woods, someone who didn't want to be seen. Or maybe it was someone hiding from something. I still don't know. But the one thing that stayed with me the most was the last detail I noticed as I drove away. The prints that circled my camp had something strange about the twisted foot. The sole pattern didn't match any boot I knew. The normal foot had a regular tread, but the twisted one had almost no tread at all. It looked smooth, like a bare foot wrapped in something thin. That part bothered me more than anything else. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake at night thinking about those slow, dragging steps moving around my tent. And every time I go camping, no matter how peaceful the place looks, I sleep with one hand on my rifle and a light pointed at the tree line. Because out there in the woods, the scariest things are never monsters or ghosts. They're the people who choose to live where no one can see what they do. I had been wanting a quiet break from work for months, and by late October of 2016, I finally decided to take a long weekend and go camping alone in northern Arizona. I was 28 at the time, tired of the noise in Phoenix, and I thought a few days surrounded by tall pines and cold air would help clear my mind. I picked a spot near an old Forest Service road outside a small town called Pine Ridge, a place I had never been to before. The pictures online made it look peaceful. Wide open spaces, thick woods, and not many people around. That sounded perfect to me then. I drove up early in the morning, my old gray truck loaded with a basic tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water jugs, and a small cooler. The sun had just come up when I reached the dirt road. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frozen pine needles that crunched loudly under my boots when I stepped out. The air smelled fresh, cleaner than what I was used to in the city. My plan was simple. Set up camp, take a slow walk through the woods, cook something easy on my small stove, and spend the night away from everything. My campsite was a small clearing a little downhill from the road. The trees around it were tall and close together, dark on the edges where the light didn't reach. It felt private and safe at first. I pitched my tent near a fallen log and set up the rest of my things. For hours, nothing bothered me. The day passed quietly with me walking around, taking photos, and sitting on the log watching the wind move through the branches. The only sounds I heard were birds, the wind, and the occasional crack of a branch falling somewhere deeper in the woods. When the sun started to drop, the temperature went down fast. I put on a thicker jacket and prepared a simple dinner. By the time I finished eating, the forest had gone completely dark. There were no other campers, no nearby houses, no car lights in the distance. Just total darkness except for my small fire. It was peaceful in a lonely kind of way. I sat for a while watching the flames until they burned low. Then I put them out, crawled into my tent, and pulled myself into my sleeping bag. I wasn't nervous yet. Everything still felt normal. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud at first. It was faint, slow steps on leaves. The kind of sound you make when you walk carefully, not wanting anyone to hear you. I lay still, my eyes open in the darkness. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe an elk. Those were common in the area, and the noise wasn't fast or aggressive. But something about the pattern of the steps felt wrong. They were too slow, too steady. They paused and resumed in a way that made my stomach tighten. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps circled the clearing, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see anything through the tent walls. I felt the cold air seeping through the thin fabric, and I realized I could hear my own heartbeat. After a minute or two, the steps stopped completely. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. It felt like whatever was out there had stopped to listen, too. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I must have drifted back into a light sleep because the next time I woke up, it was because of a sharper sound, something snapping under weight. Not a small branch, a heavy one. This time the steps were closer, much closer. I could hear them right behind my tent, slow and deliberate. I froze inside my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The footsteps moved from one side of the tent to the other, slow enough that it made my hands numb from fear. I had my pocket knife in my bag, but gripping it didn't make me feel safer. The tent walls felt too thin, too weak, like anything could tear through them if it really wanted to. The steps stopped again, not far away, right outside. I tried to hold still, but my body was shaking. The cold didn't help. For several minutes, nothing moved. The forest around me was silent again, unnaturally silent. Felt like the entire place was waiting. When the steps finally started again, they moved away from the tent, fading back into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep after that. I sat awake until the first pale light came through the tent walls. When the sky brightened and the cold blue light turned to a weak yellow, I crawled out slowly, expecting to see nothing. but the soft ground around my tent told a different story. There were footprints in the pine needles, human footprints, clear and deep. They circled the entire tent, close enough that I could have touched whatever made them if I had reached my hand through the fabric. The prints weren't from boots. They looked like old sneakers with worn soles. The sight of them made my chest tighten in a way I can't explain. The size looked like they belonged to a grown adult, maybe a man. I looked around the clearing carefully. The woods were silent again, but not in the peaceful way they had been the day before. Now the silence felt heavy, like something was still watching from somewhere I couldn't see. The sun was barely up, but I knew I wasn't going to stay there another second. I packed my things fast, stuffing everything into the truck without caring how messy it was. Before driving off, I walked a few steps toward the tree line to look at the ground more closely. The footprints didn't just circle the tent. They came from the woods and went back into them, deeper into an area where the trees grew thicker and the light barely touched the ground. There were long drag marks in the dirt, like someone had pulled a stick or rope through the needles. I don't know why, but that detail bothered me more than anything else. On the drive back down the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors even though I knew I was alone. My hands were shaking the whole time. When I got to the main highway and headed south toward Pine Ridge, I finally let myself breathe, but something still didn't feel right. I kept replaying the night in my head. The slow steps, the long pauses, the way the person never said a word, never made any sound except for footsteps. It felt like they had been studying me, watching me sleep from just a few feet away. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station to calm down. While I was filling the tank, I noticed something that made my chest tighten again. On the passenger side window, near the bottom corner of the glass, there were smudges. Long, thin smudges, like fingerprints dragged slowly downward. I hadn't touched that side of the truck before leaving. The prints weren't clear enough to see details, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone had touched my truck before I woke up and packed. They had been closer than I thought. I drove straight home without stopping again. For days afterward, I felt like someone was following me, even though I knew that was probably just fear sticking in my mind. I kept thinking about how quiet the person had been, how they never tried to talk, shout, or scare me. It felt like they had been waiting for something, maybe waiting to see if I would leave my tent or unzip it in the dark. I reported what happened to the local authorities, but they didn't find anything when they checked the area. They said it was probably a drifter, maybe someone living off the grid nearby. The forest was big enough for someone to hide for years without anyone knowing. That answer didn't calm me. In the end, nothing else happened. No one followed me home. No one came to my door. But the thought of those slow steps, circling me as I slept, stayed with me for a long time. I still hear them sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. The thin crunch of pine needles under careful feet. The long pauses. The feeling of being watched by someone who doesn't speak. I haven't camped alone since that night in 2016. I still love nature, but I learned something important out there in the cold, dark woods of northern Arizona. The scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters or anything from stories. The scariest things are real people who move quietly in the night, who don't need to say a word, who wait and watch from just beyond the edge of the light. I always liked being alone in the woods, but after what happened in the fall of 2019, I don't think I'll ever camp by myself again. I was 31 then, living in northern Colorado and working long hours in a small warehouse. The kind of shift work that drains your mind until quiet evenings in nature feel like the only way to breathe. I planned a simple 2-night trip in late September. Nothing dramatic, just a chance to get away. I picked a spot far from any campground, somewhere I wouldn't hear other people or see their lights. I drove out toward the edge of the Roosevelt National Forest, parked by a dirt pull-off, and walked nearly 2 miles uphill with my pack. The air felt cold enough to pinch my nose, and fallen leaves stuck to my boots with every step. I set up beside a thin line of pines with their needles spread across the ground like a brown blanket. The earth there was soft, and the ground sloped just enough that I had a view of a long stretch of trees below. I could hear a small creek running somewhere in the distance, low and steady. It was the kind of spot that made you feel totally cut off from the world, and that was exactly why I chose it. The first night was normal. I ate a simple meal I heated over a small stove, stretched out inside my tent, and stared at the faint glow of the sky through the mesh. The woods were quiet, only breaking every now and then with a crack of a branch or the dry rustle of animals moving through leaves. I slept lighter than usual because the cold kept pushing through the tent walls, but I still slept. When I woke the next morning, the sun was pale and slow to warm the air. I walked around the area, found a fallen log to sit on, and watched the treetops shift with the morning wind. Nothing felt wrong until late afternoon. It started with a feeling, the kind that hits without warning, like walking into a room and knowing someone has just left. I couldn't explain it. The trees looked the same, the quiet was the same, and the air smelled like cold pine and dirt like always. But something felt off, as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me after a long week of work. I kept busy, gathered some dry branches to burn later, ate early, and tried to relax. It didn't help much. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder. By the time the sky turned orange, the uneasy feeling had grown heavy. I kept hearing little snaps in the woods far behind my tent. Not big ones, just enough to make me freeze. I didn't see anything when I looked, just the long stretch of pines fading into shadow. I convinced myself it was deer or maybe squirrels hopping between branches. Around dusk, I decided to walk down toward the small creek to wash my hands and stretch my legs. I followed a narrow path between the trees, and that's when I noticed something strange. Off to my right, about 40 yards away, there was a dark shape standing between two thick pines. It wasn't moving, not at all. At first I thought it was a dead tree stump or a big rock, but the shape was too tall, too narrow. My throat tightened. I stood still and stared at it for nearly half a minute. Nothing. No movement, no sound. The shadow blended into the dimming woods, and after a while I forced myself to turn away. I told myself I imagined it. The creek water was colder than I expected. I dipped my hands and splashed my face, trying to shake off the nervousness that had been building inside me all day. When I started heading back toward my camp, I kept scanning the trees. The shape was gone. That didn't help my nerves. Night fell completely by the time my fire started burning. The flames were small, just enough to give off a glow, but every time they flickered, my shadow stretched long across the pine needles. I tried reading the old paperback I brought, but my eyes kept drifting to the edges of the firelight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something watched me. Then the noises started again. Not the usual forest noises. These were soft steps, slow and careful, circling but never coming too close. It reminded me of someone pacing while trying not to be heard. I sat frozen with the book in my lap, staring past the firelight into the dark. My skin crawled from the top of my neck down my arms. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there. When the steps eventually stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It felt like something had settled into a place where it could watch me without moving. My stomach turned with a deep, heavy dread that made it hard to breathe. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. I zipped it shut slowly, as if doing it quietly would matter. I lay on my sleeping bag staring at the ceiling, listening for every sound. I didn't even close my eyes at first. I kept my hand on the handle of the small camping knife I always carry. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it. A single, sharp crack from the trees. Then another. Then something stepped closer, slow, heavy, deliberate. It wasn't a deer. Deer move light, scattered, unsure. This sounded like something tall shifting its weight as it stepped. I felt every hair on my body stand up. I held my breath and didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped right outside the edge of my camp. I could picture exactly where that was, just beyond where the fire embers glowed faintly. The sound of the wind died completely. I waited. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then something brushed against my tent. Not a paw, not something soft. It sounded like fingers dragging lightly across the fabric. My heart hammered in my throat. I tightened my grip on the knife and stayed perfectly still. The dragging stopped. Then one slow step shifted the ground. The dirt outside crunched like dry bones under weight. Another step. It circled the tent once, maybe twice. Couldn't even swallow. I could feel its presence through the thin fabric, like standing too close to a stranger in a dark hall. Then everything went still. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't sleep at all. At some point, the footsteps faded away, but I didn't trust it. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for the faintest light to come through the tent. Only when I could see the shapes of the trees outside did I finally unzip the flap. The area around my camp looked the same, but the ground wasn't. Near the back of my tent, the pine needles were disturbed in a wide arc, like something had stood there for a long time. There were long impressions in the dirt too, not quite footprints, but close enough that I could see where weight had pressed down. They were larger than mine, longer, and there were marks on the side of my tent, a thin line where something had dragged slowly. I packed my things as fast as I ever have in my life. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I kept looking toward the trees, half expecting to see that tall shadow again. I didn't see it, but I heard something far off, a dry crack in the woods, like something moving away. On the hike back to my car, I felt watched the entire time. Every few minutes I turned around, sure I would see a shape standing between the pines. I never did, but the feeling stayed, following me all the way until I reached the dirt road. By the time I locked my car and started driving, my hands were trembling so hard I had to grip the wheel tighter just to keep straight. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone what I thought it was. I didn't want to explain marks in the dirt or why I felt hunted for a night. All I know is that something was out there with me. Something that moved like a person but didn't feel like one. Something that watched me for hours, creeping closer when it thought I was asleep. Whatever it was, it wanted to get close. It wanted to study me, and it didn't need to speak or show itself to make its presence clear. People use different names for things like that: skinwalker, mimic, watcher. But names don't matter much when you're alone in the dark and something is standing right outside your tent. All I know is that I left those woods at sunrise, and I've never gone back. I still think about it sometimes, usually late at night when the house is too quiet. I didn't see its face, I didn't hear it speak, and I didn't stay long enough to find out what it really wanted. But the feeling that followed me out of those trees, that cold, crawling awareness on the back of my neck, has never completely disappeared. And I'm sure of one thing: whatever I met that night was real. Not a ghost, not a story, not a trick of the mind. Real. And watching. It was the summer of 2017, and I had finally managed to take a break from my job in Chicago. I was 28 at the time, a little burned out from the city grind, and I decided to head out west for some solo camping. I ended up in northern Idaho, somewhere deep in the Bitterroot National Forest. The forest was dense, with tall pines and firs stretching endlessly in every direction. I had read about a small, rarely used campsite near a creek, far from the main trails, and I thought it would be perfect for some quiet alone time. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was overcast, a heavy gray that made everything feel muted and damp. The air smelled earthy, mixed with the scent of wet pine needles. I carried a small backpack with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a compact stove, water, and a flashlight. I wanted to keep it light since I had to hike almost 2 miles from the nearest parking area. The first thing I noticed while setting up camp was how quiet it was. There were no birds singing, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the creek nearby sounded different, almost muffled by the thick mist rolling off the mountains. I set up my tent on a slight incline, hoping that the rain that the forecast had predicted wouldn't turn the ground to mud. By the time I had my tent pitched, the clouds had thickened, and a cold drizzle began to fall. The rain started slowly, just a soft tapping on the tent's rainfly, but it quickly became heavier. Soon, the entire forest was soaked in a gray haze, the branches dripping constantly, the ground slick and soft underfoot. I cooked a simple dinner of instant noodles on my small stove, trying to enjoy the sound of rain around me. There was something oddly comforting about the rhythmic patter on the tent, like the forest itself was breathing around me. Night fell quickly. In these remote areas, darkness is more complete than in any city. The rain had stopped in short bursts, then started again with sudden bursts of intensity. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, flashlight off, staring at the walls of my tent, listening to the storm. Around midnight, I started hearing it, a low, persistent thump coming from somewhere beyond the tent. At first, I thought it was a branch falling in the wind, or maybe a small animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound was deliberate, almost rhythmic, and it didn't match the random noises of the forest. I unzipped the tent slightly to peek outside. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and visibility was almost zero. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, shadows flickering in the dim light. That's when I saw it. A figure or something that looked like a person, moving slowly along the treeline, just at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't close, maybe 50 feet away, but I could see it distinctly enough to know it wasn't wearing bright colors. Everything was muted in dark clothing, drenched and blending into the shadows. I froze. My first thought was that it was another camper, but I quickly realized that no one else had access to this spot that night. It was far off any main trails, and I had been alone on the hike in. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on briefly, sweeping the beam toward the figure. The light caught on the glint of something metallic in their hand, a long, thin object that I couldn't identify. The figure froze for a moment and then vanished into the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, fueled by the rain and isolation. But then I heard the thumping again, closer this time, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. Something or someone was circling me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept my breathing as quiet as possible and crawled to the front of the tent to peek out again. The rain had reduced visibility, but I could make out vague shapes moving through the dark, wet trees. The thumping was accompanied now by a faint scraping sound, like boots dragging along wet soil. I realized I had to make a decision fast. Staying in the tent felt like a trap, but leaving into the darkness in the storm seemed even worse. I remembered the creek nearby. It ran downhill and would lead to a larger trail if I followed it. I decided to wait until the figure moved away, then make a run for it. I stayed as still as possible, pretending to be asleep, listening as the steps circled slowly around the camp. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. My flashlight was off to avoid attracting attention, and I had nothing but my backpack and a small pocket knife. At around 3 a.m., the rain lessened to a drizzle, and I noticed the sounds moving away, heading back into the forest. I didn't wait to confirm. I unzipped my tent silently, grabbed my backpack, and slipped into the darkness along the edge of the creek. My feet sank into mud and wet leaves, but I kept moving, following the sound of running water. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I forced myself to stay calm, keeping the creek to my left as a guide. I walked for nearly an hour, mud soaking through my shoes, my clothes heavy with rain, my body trembling from cold and fear. The forest began to thin slightly, and faint moonlight filtered through the clouds. Finally, I saw a dim glow ahead. It was a ranger's cabin I had seen marked on the map earlier. Relief hit me like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I approached slowly, not sure if I'd be seen, but as I got closer, a porch light flicked on, and a figure stepped out. I explained my situation quickly, soaked and shivering. The ranger radioed for assistance and offered me a warm place to rest for the night. By dawn, the storm had fully passed. The forest looked calm, almost serene, as if nothing had happened. I watched from the cabin's porch, sipping a cup of hot coffee, reflecting on the night. Whatever had been circling my camp had vanished, leaving only mud prints and broken branches in its wake. Later, I learned from the ranger that there had been reports of poachers operating in the area, targeting remote campsites and hikers. That metallic glint I had seen, it was probably a weapon or a tool, and I realized how close I had come to real danger. I spent the next day hiking back to the main road with the ranger, my nerves still on edge. Even in daylight, the forest felt different, alive in a way that was unsettling. When I finally reached my car, soaked and exhausted, I felt a profound relief. That night in the forest, alone, in the rain, had tested me in ways I hadn't expected. It left me with a new respect for isolation, for nature's raw unpredictability, and for how careful one has to be when venturing into the wilderness. Even years later, whenever I think about that night, I remember the smell of wet pine, the sound of relentless rain, the cold mud under my hands and feet, and the figure that disappeared into the dark. But I also remember the feeling of survival, the relief of finding safety, and the clarity of knowing that sometimes the forest holds real danger, and sometimes your own quick thinking and caution is what keeps you alive. I was 31 the year I decided to camp alone in the mountains near northern Idaho. It was early September of 2019, the kind of time when the air feels like summer during the day but drops fast the moment the sun sinks. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, barely stepping outside, and I convinced myself that a quiet weekend in the woods would fix something inside me. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, and enough food for 2 days. I chose a place far from the usual trails, a clearing beside an old logging road that hardly anyone used anymore. I liked the idea of being alone, or at least I thought I did. The drive into the hills took longer than I planned because the road turned rough near the end. Loose rocks clattered under the tires, and branches scraped the side of my truck. When I stepped out, the silence hit me first. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of stillness that almost feels heavy, as if the whole forest is holding its breath. The clearing was wide, maybe 40 yards across, with tall pines around it that blocked most of the sky. I could smell sap and dry needles and the faint scent of cold earth. I set up my tent in the flattest spot I could find. The ground was covered in soft brown needles that cushioned each step. I dropped my pack against a fallen tree and walked around the area to get familiar with it. The forest looked normal enough, just miles of trees and dark undergrowth, but there was something strange about how untouched it seemed. No trash, no footprints, no sign of anyone having camped there in a long time. I liked that at first, thinking I had found the perfect place. The first few hours passed slowly. I cooked a small meal as the sun went down, the sky turning from pale blue to a dull orange behind the treetops. As darkness crept in, I noticed how cold it got. The wind picked up and moved through the branches like a slow breath. By the time I crawled inside my tent, the temperature felt like late autumn, and the air smelled sharper, almost metallic. I lay on my back for a long time, listening to the forest. It wasn't silent anymore. I could hear the soft clicking of insects, the distant rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. All of it sounded normal enough until I realized something odd. None of the noises came close. Everything stayed far out, like the entire forest kept its distance from my campsite. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that was much closer. Something moved in the clearing. Not a quick movement like a small animal, and not the confident steps of a large one either. It was slow, uneven, like someone taking careful steps through the needles. I lay completely still, breathing shallow. The walls of my tent felt paper thin. The sound moved around the edge of the clearing, staying just out of sight. I could hear each step clearly. Soft crunch. Pause. Soft crunch again. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe even an elk. But the rhythm was wrong. Animals in the wild don't move like that. They move with more intention, faster, without those strange delays between each step. The thing out there seemed to be listening, thinking, adjusting. It circled once. Then the steps faded until I could no longer hear them. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. When I finally drifted off, the sky was already turning gray. In the morning, I checked the ground around the clearing. There were marks, but not clear ones, just scattered disturbances in the needles. No prints deep enough to identify, and too messed up to tell what direction anything came from. I tried to shake off the unease, blaming it on how tired I was. I cooked breakfast, walked around the forest, tried to convince myself everything was normal. But I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see something standing between the trunks. That afternoon, clouds rolled in thick and gray. The temperature dropped again. I gathered more firewood, filling my arms until they ached. The clearing felt smaller than before, like the trees had leaned in closer. I kept hearing distant sounds, soft cracks, low thumps, but every time I turned my head, everything looked still. Near evening, I found something that made the hair on my arms stand straight. Behind my tent, maybe 15 feet into the trees, I found a tree trunk with fresh scrape marks. The bark was peeled off in long strips about the height of my chest. The edges of each strip were clean, as if cut with something sharp. But there were no tool marks, no jagged edges like an axe might leave, no sign of claws, just smooth, peeled bark. I stood there staring at it for a long time, feeling the cold seep deeper into my chest. I didn't know what made the marks, but I didn't like the idea of being the only person in an empty forest with something that did that. As night fell, I built a larger fire than the night before. Flames cracked loudly and threw long shadows across the clearing. I kept my flashlight beside me even though the batteries were low. I sat near the fire until late, staring into the dark trees. The forest felt alive, but not in a good way. Felt like it was watching. Started again around 1 a.m. I heard the same slow steps in the needles, coming from the same direction as last night. This time they were closer. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I lay flat in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, the cold fabric brushing against my face. The steps stopped right outside the tent. Not on the side, not near the entrance. Right at the back, as if something stood inches away from my head. I could hear the faintest sound, like cloth brushing against bark. Something shifted its weight. The tent fabric didn't move, but I felt its presence. Heavy, patient, deliberate. It stayed there for what felt like minutes. Then I heard it walk away, but not back into the forest. It moved slowly across the clearing, passing the fire pit where the ashes still held a faint red glow. The steps were light, almost careful. I kept expecting them to fade, but they didn't. They went to the far side of the clearing and stopped again. When the silence returned, it felt worse than the footsteps. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave. My nerves were shredded, and the feeling of being watched had burrowed deep. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into my truck without caring about order. The air felt frozen and heavy, like the forest didn't want me moving too fast. Before leaving, I walked one last circle around the clearing just to make sure I didn't forget anything. That's when I found something I hadn't seen earlier. Near the tree line, right across from where my tent had been, the needles looked pressed down in a long, narrow shape. It wasn't a footprint. It looked more like a place where someone had knelt for a long time. The depression was almost the length of a person, as if something lay flat on the ground, staring toward my tent. I felt sick when I realized it lined up perfectly with where my head had been while I slept. I didn't stay another minute. I got in my truck and drove down the rough road faster than I should have. The trees seemed to crowd the sides of the path, and every shadow felt too deep. Even when I reached the main road, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something step out behind me. I didn't stop until I reached town. Only when I heard the noise of cars and saw people walking around did the tension finally ease enough for me to breathe normally again. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound in my house felt like a step outside my window. I kept thinking about that long, pressed-down shape in the needles, the scrape marks on the tree trunk, the slow steps circling my tent. I knew it wasn't a ghost or some storybook creature. Whatever it was real. Someone had been there with me. Someone who didn't make a sound except for those slow steps. Someone who watched me sleep from only a few feet away. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was knowing that I never heard them arrive, and I never heard them leave. I didn't scare them off. They left because they wanted to, and that, more than anything, made me realize how lucky I was to wake up at all. I haven't camped alone since then. I don't think I ever will again. I was 28, traveling solo through Europe, and after a few days of city hopping, I found myself in a remote corner of Austria. The plan was simple. Camp for a couple of days to clear my mind, disconnect from the digital world, and just be out in nature. I'd found this small camping site on a map, tucked between the rolling hills of the Alps, near a little village called Kitzbühel. The area seemed serene, untouched by the chaos of modern life. When I arrived at the site, it was perfect. There were only a handful of campers, and the space was wide open with tall pines surrounding the area. The air was fresh, the kind that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. I pitched my tent near the edge of the woods, not far from a bubbling stream that I could hear faintly in the distance. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting a soft golden glow across the landscape. As evening approached, I made a small campfire, cooked up a simple meal, and leaned back to enjoy the crackling of the flames. There was something peaceful about the stillness of the place. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the far-off call of a bird. I felt like I was the only person in the world. But then, as the night crept in and the sky darkened, something shifted. I just finished eating and was sitting back, staring into the fire, when I heard footsteps. They weren't far off, and they were slow, deliberate. I thought at first it might just be another camper, maybe out for a late-night stroll. The sound was coming from the path that led deeper into the woods, not far from my tent. I waited, thinking they would pass, but the footsteps stopped. I stood up, looking around, trying to make sense of the situation. There was no one in sight. My heart started to race, but I chalked it up to the isolation. It was quiet, too quiet almost. The usual night sounds of animals had gone silent. The only noise was my own breath, shallow now, as I strained to hear. Suddenly, from behind the trees, a figure appeared. He was tall, at least 6 feet, and dressed in dark clothing, something like a long coat. The man didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at me. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out his broad shoulders and a strange, still posture. He didn't seem to be making any effort to be discreet. He just stood there. I called out, half expecting him to be someone lost or a hiker in need of directions, but he didn't respond. The way he stood, unmoving, unnerved me. There was something off about him. I could feel my stomach tighten, an instinctive unease creeping up my spine. I turned my back to the fire, thinking maybe he would just walk away if I ignored him. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in his direction, hoping the beam would break the tension, give me some clarity. The light flickered briefly before illuminating his face. He had sharp features, a gaunt face, with pale skin that looked almost sickly under the glow of the light. His eyes were wide open, but there was no emotion in them. No warmth, no curiosity, just an eerie, unsettling blankness. I froze. For a moment, it felt like everything was holding its breath, like the entire forest had gone still, waiting. I was struck by how unnatural it all seemed. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood there, watching me. My heartbeat was thundering in my chest now. I tried to speak again, but my throat had gone dry. The man took a step forward, then another. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I backed away slowly, stumbling over the ground, keeping the light fixed on him. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about his presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong here, in this peaceful, isolated place. As I moved toward my tent, I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away. I felt trapped. The man took another step, and this time he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "It's getting late," he said, his accent thick, but his tone was odd. It didn't have the warmth you would expect from someone out here in the woods at night. It was flat, mechanical, like he wasn't speaking to me but rather through me. I didn't respond. Couldn't. I just kept backing away, my mind racing through all the possible outcomes, none of which seemed good. Suddenly, the man moved faster, closing the distance between us with a speed that didn't match his earlier slow, deliberate pace. I bolted. I ran through the trees, not caring which direction I was going, just as long as I was away from him. My breath was ragged, my legs burning as I pushed myself through the brush, dodging branches that whipped at my face. I didn't look back, too afraid to see what might be coming after me. I ran for what felt like miles, but after a while, I realized I had no idea where I was. The landscape had changed. The tall pines had given way to dense thickets, and the ground was uneven, full of rocks and roots. My breath came in gasps, my panic rising as I realized I was lost. That's when I heard him again. His footsteps were behind me, close now, too close. I couldn't tell how he was moving so fast, but he was there, just behind me, gaining ground. I stumbled, my feet catching on something, and I fell hard onto the ground, scraping my knees and palms. I scrambled to get up, my heart racing, and turned to face the direction I thought I'd come from. The woods were silent again. No footsteps, no voice. I stood there, frozen for a long moment, waiting for something, anything. The forest seemed to breathe around me, the wind picking up in the trees, rustling the leaves. Then I heard it, his voice softer now, as if he were speaking to himself. "You're safe for now, but you won't be for long," he said. Then the silence returned. I don't know how much time passed before I finally found my bearings, but when I did, I started running again, this time without stopping. Eventually, I stumbled upon a narrow trail that led me out of the woods and into a clearing. I didn't stop to look around, didn't stop to breathe, just kept moving. I didn't see the man again, but I swear I could feel his eyes on me, watching me, even after I made it back to civilization. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed, that he was still out there, waiting. Even now, weeks later, I still can't get the image of his face out of my head. I don't know who he was or why he was there, but I know one thing for sure. There are some people, some things that just don't belong in the woods, and I'll never camp alone in Austria again.